Nowadays, intellectual property rights, IPRs, are crucial in the framework of EU New Generation Free Trade Agreements. They confer monopoly rights over intangible goods and services. They give IPR owners the right to prevent anyone from making or using the creation at stake. And the pivotal role played by IP and IPRs in EU free trade agreements is a consequence of the Global Europe Strategy, which was launched by the European Union in 2006 to reach the objective to foster Europe's competitiveness in foreign markets. Accordingly, since IPRs are governed by the principle of territoriality, the EU is seeking to address them through free trade agreements in order to ensure appropriate levels of IP protection in non-EU countries. So, from the conclusion of the free trade agreement between the European Union and South Korea, FTAs concluded by the European Union in recent times are important for the evolution of intellectual property. Indeed, the EU institutions repeatedly underlined that IPRs play a major role for the creativity, innovation, and competitiveness of the EU as a global player. And studies estimate that IPR-intensive sectors account for around 42% of the EU GDP, and they contribute to generating something like 38% of all jobs and 90% of EU exports. But intellectual property rights have acquired more relevance in view of ongoing and forthcoming large-scale challenges and have become a priority in many broad-spectrum multi-level EU strategies addressing core stages of the envisaged transformation of the European society's way of functioning. Indeed, for the EU it is of paramount importance to agree upon international rules aimed at safeguarding its IP standards and at reducing the risk of global breaches to IPRs. Today, counterfeit and pirated goods account for about 2.5% of global trade. As for constitutional institutional aspects, IP now falls within the scope of application of CCP, Common Commercial Policy. To tell the truth, this point was not that clear until a few years ago, since the new formulation of the legal basis for CCP, namely Article 207 TFEU, is quite ambiguous. The provision states that commercial aspects of intellectual property are part of CCP. But, in Opinion 215 concerning the text of the envisaged EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, the ECJ clarified that almost all aspects related to IP are part of CCP. And in this respect, the opinion of the ECJ does not replicate the one of the Advocate General. While the Advocate General highlighted that certain IP rights, like moral rights of copyright holders, are not commercially oriented and fall under the shared competence regime, the ECJ relied on the direct and immediate effect on trade criterion to state otherwise. So the court thus broadened the scope of application of Article 207 TFEU. As for substantial aspects characterizing the evolution of IPRs within the framework of new generation free trade agreements, it has to be stressed that those chapters do not merely, highlight the influence of international treaties on intellectual property, especially the WIPO treaties concluded after the adoption of the TRIPS. But they also emphasize the need for all parties to adhere to such agreements and introduce requirements to reduce gaps and weaknesses detected in the current international practice on IP. Furthermore, the concept of intellectual property includes multiple instances and they are regulated quite in detail. The main forms of protection falling under the IP category are copyright and related rights, trademark, patents with an emphasis on patents on pharmaceuticals, industrial designs, trade secrets, and undisclosed test or other data, geographical indications, and new variety of plants. Furthermore, as for trademarks, for example, it is worth mentioning that in certain cases, like the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, a clearly defined genuine user requirement for defense against non-use cancellation was introduced. Furthermore, pharmaceuticals are dealt with in detail, and some free trade agreements provide for the automatic protection in the territory of the counterparty of hundreds of European geographical indications and protected denominations of origins for agricultural products and for wine, spirits, and other alcoholic beverages. And the list contained in the agreements are open to future additions. Moreover, moral rights of authors are recognized and guaranteed, and high standards of civil enforcement rules were introduced in many new generation free trade agreements concluded by the European Union. And those standards go beyond the thresholds of the TRIPS agreements. In particular, the benchmark of the international framework construed by the EU is Directive 2004/38, the so-called Enforcement Directive on IP rights. Also, obligation concerning the imposition of administrative and, more exceptionally, criminal sanctions and criminal procedures were introduced in those agreements, and this certainly represents a breakthrough compared with the EU secondary law on IP and IP rights. EU New Generation Free Trade Agreements lay down rules for broader enforcement of intellectual property rights by the custom authorities. It has to be stressed that those provisions do not enjoy direct effects. Just a side note, intellectual property rights are part of the notion of investment. For example, according to Article 8, Paragraph 1 of the CETA Agreement, investment includes, among the other things, also intellectual property rights. Forms that an investment may take include, inter alia, intellectual property rights. Just one last remark concerning the counterparts of the European Union. Some criticize the EU's efforts towards the pursuit of high standards of protection of IPRs in free trade agreements. In particular, FTAs with IPRs chapters have a significant impact on members' aggregate trade, and the TRIPS Plus regime proposed by the European Union and reproduced in the text of many new generation free trade agreements is likely to be detriment to developing countries, as they need more technology transfer enhancing provisions in those agreements. And the main causes of these are the low bargaining power of those countries, the secret negotiations conducted by the European Union and the partner countries, which of course do not allow for the participation of all interested stakeholders in society, and the impossibility to strike a balance between minimum standards of intellectual property protection and enforcement on one hand, and flexibility in ceilings on the other hand.